Okay, hey guys, this is the part 2 of the abortion video lecture, and we'll be picking up right where we left off with some distortional features. So last time we talked about distortional features, and they will come up again, but I just want to continue this question of how pro-life people are responding to these charge of inconsistency we talked about last time. So most pro-lifers don't respond to Thompson by arguing through her claim of inconsistency. So they try to claim that they're not consistent because the violinist is not a morally relevant case to compare abortion to, and that is because it has morally relevant differences that we'll talk about. So what are some of these morally relevant differences that could justify treating these two cases as morally different? So this is going to, if right, prevent any analogies to abortion that Thompson is giving with her model of the violinist, which is supposed to capture the relevant features that we care about in abortion and give us some kind of answer that we can use, as well as in the case of the violinist, which is just a fictional case, the case of abortion, which is a real one. So some morally relevant disanalogies that pro-lifers use. The first one is killing versus letting die. So they see some moral difference between the act of killing on one hand and letting die on the other. So killing is pretty straightforward. It's where you're like actually causing the death of a person. So this would be like stabbing or shooting someone with a gun, where you're directly causing the death. Whereas letting die is something along the lines of not doing anything to prevent the death. So the case here is that in abortion, there seems to be something different between having the abortion on the one hand, which is killing, and letting die on the other, which is morally better, the pro-lifers are going to argue. So this is kind of taken up with the extreme view we'll talk about in a second, but basically through this distinction, they try to argue that in some cases, letting the mother die is better than actively killing the fetus. The second one is that there's special obligations to one's kin. So special obligations is going to be something like that you have a certain kind of relationship to your offspring, your son or your daughter, and those kinds of obligations are more binding than in cases of people who are not related to you. So this is going to push back against the case that the violinist is not related, so you don't have any of these special obligations. The third one is that there's some kind of difference in harm due to the difference in age. And for this one, we could imagine that someone might think that since the fetus, if they're a person, is suffering a larger harm from being aborted than the violinist who is being let to die at a somewhat developed age. Imagine he's about 30 or something. And then there's differences in burdens between the bedridden versus being mobile. So the case of Thompson isn't even good at getting at the actual harm that Thompson is wanting to talk about. So the harm that she's talking about is in the case of pregnancy, she's not modeling it well with saying that you have to stay in bed for 9 months. So these are all pretty, I think the last one, 4, is pretty good because it is the case that it seems that pregnancy is a bit less burdensome than the case that she describes, which is a problem, right? Because if she's trying to analogize the case of abortion to the violinist, it should be morally relevant. And one of the morally relevant features here is the differences in burdens. So in the Thompson case, her case seems to be much more burdensome. So this might be a problem, right? So there's ways that we could, attempt to remodel the abortion case and I'll give some guesses as to how we could, satisfy these morally relevant disanalogies. The first one is you can say that the violinist is your kin, and that one would be if you would just remake the model scenario to be a case where the violinist is your offspring, your son or your daughter. And then if you think in those cases that you could disconnect yourself from them, then that would be a more close analogy. And maybe you think this is a distortional feature because you don't think special obligations are actually morally relevant. I would be happy to hear something about that in the discussion post. So the first one, killing versus letting die. In the case of the violinist, it seems to be the case that you are letting them die. Maybe you don't think that disconnecting is actually letting die, and I would be happy to hear about that. But if it's the case that killing is actually worse than letting die, abortion would be, on the face of it, more morally wrong than letting die the violinist. So that would be something you'd have to consider. These I'll leave for you to, maybe you think that you can save the pro-life, the pro-choice position from these disanalogies, and you could start off one of the posts by picking one of these and thinking through the differences in how the violinist case would go if you modeled it to accommodate these disanalogies. In other words, these are disanalogies. Could you change the violinist case to be more analogous to abortion? And do we get the same outcome? And that would be something that would be very productive for you to do. So now we're kind of moving on to life-threatening pregnancies as the last. Last we were talking about rape-induced pregnancies because they seem to model the violinist case pretty well. But we're going to be talking about the extreme view right now, which is going to be a good way to think through the implications of life-threatening pregnancies. So life-threatening pregnancies are going to be cases where the mother is going to be at severe hazard, either certainly or uncertainly. So this could vary, right? This could be a pregnancy is just totally infeasible, meaning that it can't actually be birthed naturally without harming the mother. Or it could be the case that there's a high degree of uncertainty about the pregnancy being harmful to the mother. So there's many different nuances here, but so the extreme view is this pro-life position that is going to say that a woman is not permitted to have an abortion even when the fetus is threatening her life. That's why it's called the extreme view. And this is going to take a stance on one of the disanalogies that we talked about, which is that there's some moral difference between killing versus letting die. And killing, the intentional killing of a person that is an innocent person, is never to be performed. So this is going to exclude cases of abortions that threaten people's lives. And again, that is why it's called the extreme view. So if we're going to choose between the lives of two persons, remember, this is kind of what the pro-life person likes to frame, how they like to frame the debate. So in the abortion of a rape-induced pregnancy, remember, pro-lifer can argue that it's worse if a fetal person dies than if a woman loses her autonomy over her body for 9 months. But that argument isn't going to work with life-threatening pregnancies, as one person has to die, basically. So we see a bit of a difference in the way that the pro-lifers have to approach the question here, for the sheer fact that the differences in harm for the two parties is now equivalent, basically equivalent. At least death is likely in one of the other cases in these examples. So if we assume that the embryo could succeed the death of the person delivering it, the woman, then we could imagine that this is kind of a choice between lives rather than a choice of the more minimal harm as was framed in the pro-life position that we talked about last time. So can the pro-life people defend this extreme view? This would be also a very good question to kind of get at, because I think Thompson has an answer to this, and you might think of more reasons why this might be wrong, but it implies that you can never intentionally kill an innocent. And so Thompson's view is that this you could modify the violinist case to where you will die if you don't disconnect the violinist. And in this case, it's not murder, she thinks. It's not the unjustified intentional killing of a person if you disconnect the violinist to save your life. And this is because you can't extend the right of life, in this case, of the violinist to the death of the mother, because this is kind of just a case of self-defense. And it's so this gets at the question of, like, can you kill innocent threats that are threatening your life but not intentionally? And if you would think about the following case, that it is a thought experiment in itself to get at the thought experiment problem we just posed. If you imagine that I am hurled by a tornado at you, and you could kill me to save your own life if you're put in immediate threat, and I'm going to, just from the sheer fact of the tornado throwing me and the physics behind it, not my ill will towards you, you would be allowed to kill me. Most people, I would say yes here. Then this kind of seems to imply that it might be okay to abort a fetus that is innocent in this case, and thus refute the pro-life argument. But this, I think, to model it a bit more accurate, you have to kind of give it this number 2 here. So imagine if post-impact your organs start to fail. I hit you, but you lived, and that the only way to get to the hospital soon is to run me over, and you're going to die if I'm not ran over. You might wonder if this is a bit more like the abortion case, and whether or not you can fatally run me over might be a good way to ask the question about whether or not abortion in this case is permitted, to specifically interrogate this killing versus letting die and the impacts on the killing of an innocent. So one question you might have here is, if you can't save yourself by killing me after the impact, if you think that you're not allowed to run me over in this case number 2 here, then you can't permit abortion. And you might wonder why in the first case it seems obvious that you can kill me, why in the second case it seems like this is less okay, or at least it's not as obvious that it's okay. Maybe you don't agree, but if maybe the pro-lifers have some legs to the argument if 2 is a morally analogous way to model abortion and the killing of innocent threats. And a lot of the questions about late-stage abortion is something about third parties. So the third parties would be the doctors or the nurses attending to the abortion. And this is a point of controversy because a lot of people argue that the doctors and the nurses, the third parties, should remain neutral between the fetus and the mother's life. And again, this is granting that both of the people are considered persons. So it might be questionable. So why should the doctor take the mother's side and save her life by aborting the fetal person? And recall, we're assuming equal status. And Thompson thinks that third-party agents are able to act for other agents, and that It can be neutral here, impartial to both the mother and the fetus. And Thompson's view is that neutrality here is a mistake, because with the thought experiment of the growing mutant child that's going to crush the mother in the house unless someone intervenes, to her it seems obvious that in this case someone could intervene in a way that would decide that the innocent threat should be prevented from killing the mother, who is also innocent. And she even says that the third party needn't be even neutral, but can side with the house owners. So this is to show that you shouldn't be neutral in these cases. They needn't be neutral. So to give an example of how this neutrality works, so imagine that there's two people, there's Smith and Jones, and Smith accidentally takes the coat of Jones on a really cold night, and Smith is going to freeze to death the previous owner of the coat, remember, if he isn't returned the coat. So if the police appear on the scene, do they have to be neutral between the coat being currently illicitly, not quite illegal, but illegally in the possession of Jones's, and Jones is going to live because he has accidentally taken the coat through no fault of his own, right? But he is in the possession of another person's property. Do we think that the police have to be neutral? In this case, I think most people would side on the case of the coat returning to Smith, because it doesn't seem that Jones has a better claim to the coat, because it's not his property, one, and two, the burdens are equal between the agents. If it was the case that Smith could survive without the coat, we might think differently. But neutrality doesn't seem to be a relevant moral feature here, because it's just the case that the burdens are equal, and the property right says that coat goes back to Smith. So we're going to talk about unwanted pregnancies due to consensual sex, which is going to be where a pro-life argument is going to kind of claim that some kind of consent and willingness to engage in sex is going to make the mother responsible for the resulting child. So Thompson directly responds to this, and she gives a kind of two thought experiments. So there's these people seeds and a burglar. And it is something like, if you take precaution against an outcome, in this case, we'll talk about the people seeds here, because I think it's a bit better. If you take actions to prevent people seeds from coming in through the window, people seeds are seeds that will turn to people if they get into your house, so you want to keep them out. And she gives this thought experiment where the person puts up a screen on a window, but through no fault of their own, the screen is damaged and a seed is allowed to come in. And she thinks that this intentional taking a stance of not wanting people seeds to be in your house means that you can kind of separate the act of sex and the getting pregnant morally. That is, obviously we can separate them descriptively, but morally here is the point, because you're taking precautions against something happening. You don't want to consent to having a kid. So in cases of accidental pregnancies, this is supposed to show you that you're allowed to remove the people seeds if they get into your house after you have taken precaution to avoid them. So the line here is that Thompson claims that taking risk doesn't mean one agrees to whatever happens or has a duty to provide needed aid if the risk is accidentally incurred. So they're not, on Thompson's view, women who become accidentally pregnant aren't committed to this, aren't committed to the moral responsibility of the fetus's survival for this reason. So this is what Thompson is going to say to the responsibility objection. So Thompson doesn't believe that the mother has a special responsibility for the fetus, even though through her voluntary sexual intercourse brought the fetus into life, into existence, and that there must be a implicit or explicit assumption of duties. So there must have been a verbal or implicit agreement to consensually create a child, not just sex on her account, that is going to make a responsibility for ensuring that the child is born and has all the needed things for a flourishing life. These duties don't apply in the case, Thompson says, to cases where there is not an implicit or explicit assumption of duties. That is to say, an agreement that you are trying to have a kid. And this is going to extend so far as that there's no duty to save without consent. So this would mean that if a baby is left on your doorstep, you don't have these deep obligations, right? I think this is a bit missing the point, because if a baby is just left on your doorstep, you might have an obligation to drop it off somewhere, but it's not the case that you would have to provide for the baby if it just showed up on your doorstep one day. So there's differences in burdens between unwanted pregnancy and child support, and this is where the pro-lifers might stake out if they are really committed to pushing through this idea that you can't have an abortion. A natural outcropping of this is to try to think of ways to make moral obligations apply to people who have had to go through with having a kid. So this kind of leans on some of the previous arguments, which is to say that there's a greater imposition to have your body gestate a fetus than to have your wages garnished. So a way to build out this position is to acknowledge that the man in the situation has to provide for the offspring, and that child support is much less of a burden than gestating a fetus. So in balancing these kinds of considerations, we have to consider that if you're obligated to carry a kid, then you have also the obligation to make sure that it has everything it needs to have a flourishing life. And in order to do that, you are going to have obligations of the father or to provide for the kid in this case. And while we're talking about this, it's worthy to note that there's not clearly obvious connection between moral and causal responsibility. At least they're not identical. So don't conflate moral responsibility on the one hand and causal responsibility on the other hand. Causal responsibility is, like physical descriptions of what is happening, and then moral responsibility is how we establish blame. So while the sexually active woman is obviously partly responsible for this causal act of the fetus coming about, it might be the case that she's not morally responsible for having the kid. So physical responsibility is not doesn't entail moral responsibility, and if you're not morally responsible, you don't seem to have a duty to alleviate that condition. So a good case is if you're pushed, and while you're waiting in line for Tim Hortons, you're pushed and you stumble backwards and step on someone's foot and their foot breaks. We don't think that you are responsible for it. We think the person that pushed you is responsible for it. And what's more, we think that the person that pushed you is morally responsible for alleviating the broken foot. For instance, he might sue and gain some money to pay for the medical bills. But you in this, while being a proximate cause, are not directly morally responsible for this. So to think about this kind of last section of the presentation. So Thompson believes that cases of late abortion are morally indecent, but shouldn't be undergone. But that if one did abort in such situations, it would not be unjust. It would be, that is to say, it wouldn't be a violation of anyone's rights. It would be just indecent. So what is morally indecent but just acts? This is something like if a boy gets a bunch of chocolates and he refuses to share the chocolates with any of his classmates or his siblings. Morally indecent, but not unjust. So another one is an example that Thompson brings up is that Henry Fonda, if Henry Fonda could suddenly heal you by just laying his hand on your head, would he be obligated to travel across the country to touch your head to cure you and save you from dying? Thompson argues that he's not obligated. This is something that it would be indecent for him not to do, but it would not be unjust for him not to do, because we don't normally think that people have obligations to do these things. So the Good Samaritan stuff comes up in Thompson a bit because she believes that the Good Samaritan is kind of how the pro-lifers are supporting the claim that women should carry kids even if they don't want to carry them. And this is supposed to be using the Good Samaritanism. And for those of you who don't know, Good Samaritanism is it's a story from the Bible where a person was traveling on a road and noticed that a person was in need, and he took them to the nearest inn, and they were injured, so he paid for their injuries to be healed, and he paid for them to recover in the inn. This is what is being a Good Samaritan, doing things that are not required of you, but that we consider morally good. So if you are in the violinist's case, if you are in the position of being hooked up to the violinist, you're a Good Samaritan if you if you stay in bed for 9 months and allow the violinist to live. It is not morally required, but it is a case of Good Samaritanism. And Thompson doesn't believe that this is a good example because she thinks that women who are going through pregnancies when they don't want to, or in the case of the violinist, this is not a case of a Good Samaritan. This is a case of like a splendid Samaritan because in the case of the Samaritan, all he did was take the person to an inn and handed over some money. In the case of pregnancy or the violinist, it's 9 months. This is like far beyond what is we're supposed to take away from the Good Samaritan thought experiment. Further, Thompson thinks that the pro-lifers are a bit hypocritical and are operating in bad faith when they don't talk about any other cases of Good Samaritanism other than these anti-abortion positions. So we'll kind of conclude here just with talking about a problem for more moderate views of abortion, because we've been talking about these positions that are kind of not at the margins, but a bit more filled out, a bit more extreme than a moderate version. So the question is, can the lack of personhood and moral status of the embryo provide a way to prohibit late abortions? And more importantly, avoid permitting infanticide. So this is a worry of the pro-lifers for the pro-choice position, is that it might be the case that infanticide is permitted. And so for late-term, minimally minded fetuses and newborns are not self-conscious, rational moral agents. So these late fetuses, they have very few psychological connections to the future that death would prevent. So in these cases, it seems like it might be an unfavorable outcome that infanticide is permitted for these reasons. So to kind of conclude here, the violinist thought experiment is supposed to show that abortion is permissible, even if the fetus is a person with a right to life. So the violinist also reveals that abortion debate isn't a conflict of rights between the right to life and the right to control one's body. Extreme cases involve choosing between two rights to life and not bodily control versus a right to life. So this was what Thompson was complaining about, that it's not actually a conflict of rights. It's the not a right of bodily control versus a right to life. So the fetus doesn't have a right to bodily control, but you do have a right to life. So Thompson believes that killing the fetus in self-defense is not murder. It's unjustified, which is to say it's unjustified intentional killing of a person. She does not believe that. And she believes that third parties can take the woman's side, and they don't have to be neutral in these cases where the doctor has to administer the abortion, which is most cases, right? And we talked about the people seeds, which is supposed to show that taking chance pregnancy will result, doesn't make the woman morally responsible. And some of the criticisms that we talked about was that the pro-lifers are going to argue that there is morally relevant differences, that is distortional features, in Thompson's violence case that prevent us from analogizing to the case of abortion. And lastly, pregnant women who engage in consensual sex are supposed to be vulnerable to this responsibility argument, which says that willingly engaging in consensual sex is going to make obligations to actually care for the kid. So what I want you to kind of take away from this is that the abortion debate's very hard, and there's good arguments on both sides. And if you don't change your mind, I hope you just got something out of this, and maybe you got more knowledge about the opposing positions. And I hope that this kind of recognition of the difficulty of these problems is going to make you a bit more open-minded in the future. So I will see you guys next week, and thanks for tuning in.